Welcome to the Project Zion podcast. This podcast explores the unique spiritual and theological gifts Community of Christ offers for today's world.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Project Zion podcast. This is your host, Robin Linkhart, and today is another edition in our series, What's Brewing, where we explore how God is showing up in the neighborhood and people of faith are living out mission in transforming ways. Today we are here with Kris Judd and Dr. Vincent Lewis. Kris is a lifelong member of Community of Christ and has served the church in a number of ways: congregational youth leader, outreach minister, and pastor, to name a few. She also served as the International Community of Christ staff pastor. She served as a Community of Christ president of 70 for a number of years, including secretary for the council. Currently, Kris holds the priesthood office of evangelist and supports the ministries of evangelists around the world by serving as the secretary to the Order of Evangelists. Kris is a certified spiritual director, offering spiritual direction to members, serving as staff for the Spiritual Formation and Companioning Program, as well as the World Church Spiritual Formation Team. Kris and her husband, Peter, live in Des Moines, Iowa, where she is involved in ministries at a congregational, mission center, and community level. And on top of that, Kris is now a licensed private investigator in the state of Iowa. From an early age, Vince knew he was destined to help others. His eager support of community projects as a middle schooler eventually led to continued community service as a teacher and later a principal. His service expanded to include community boards, committees, and ordained ministry. One constant thread ran through everything: the celebration and appreciation of diversity. And Vince has a list of diverse experiences to match: football, wrestling, military service, woodworking, degrees in elementary and special education, including master's and specialist degrees, and a doctorate in administration and counseling. In total, Vince served 39 years in Des Moines Public Schools. Post-retirement for a man who simply cannot sit still found Vince at Children and Families Urban Movement, an inner-city, community-based youth and family program. Vince became a member of Community of Christ in 1977. He has served in many leadership roles as an ordained minister, including Mission Center President, Financial Officer of Lamoni Heartland Mission Center 2015 to 2020. The list of public and community service goes on and on. Vince and wife Linda, a retired public school teacher and consultant, and now a full-time artist, reside in West Des Moines, Iowa. They have 4 grown children and 6, listeners, I want you to hear this, 6 beautiful and perfect grandchildren. Vince and Kris serve as co-chairs of the Lamoni Heartland Mission Center Diversity Team. And I got to tell you, they are a ball of energy, and put those two together and who knows what might happen. In 2020, the diversity team embarked on a new journey, providing a series of online diversity workshops intended to help the church and its disciples learn how to uphold and live the principle, the worth of all persons, and to also pursue the church's mission of peace. These workshops focus on actions and behaviors that allow each of our previously marginalized brothers and sisters to feel included, valued, respected, and appreciated. The workshop looks at the big systemic picture of exclusion and misunderstanding those who are viewed as other, as well as taking a good look at our own congregations and lives to see where God is inviting us to repent and change. So a great big welcome to you, Kris and Vince. It's great to have you with us today on Project Zion Podcast.
Thank you, Robin. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for the invite.
So let's just take a few minutes to get to know you a bit better. Please tell us something about you, how you became connected with Community of Christ, and what brought you to a life of ministry so deeply connected with justice and peace. Vince.
Well, first of all, my connection with the justice and peace efforts. As a young lad, I was very much interested in the civil rights movement. It was very active during my youthful years. I remember and recall a period of time in my life where I had to make a decision as to whether Malcolm X was I was going to follow, or Martin Luther King. And as a young child, being one who was not fond of violence, was not fond of physical aggression or being mean to people, I really liked the teaching of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so I have always tried to be a student of Dr. Martin Luther King and a follower and a student of the civil rights movement. And with that, it was a natural transition as I grew older and studied more and more, learned more and more, and taught more and more about peace, about justice, about civil rights, about human beings, treating all human beings in a humane manner. And that was just a natural transition as I became associated with the church. My association with the church came later, much later, as you mentioned earlier, in 1977. And it was by way of a young lady that I was working with at my first teaching position. And it was her first teaching position as well. And so she introduced me to the church, invited me to a young adult activity at one time, and enjoyed that activity. Then another young adult activity, and then finally a couple of church services, and it simply grew from there. That young lady that invited me to that is now 42 years, 3 years in being my wife. But that's how I became introduced and aware of the church.
Thanks, Vince. Kris.
Well, Robin, as you mentioned, I have been a lifelong member of this church. And as I've thought about my life and how and when and where did this interest and passion for peace and justice, especially for those on the margins, how did that come about? It's been a part of my life since I was a child. And I think a good part of that was the stories of Zion, the dream of Zion, the peaceable kingdom, and this place of justice for all. And I remember as a kid being drawn to those other students or children in my classes that were on the edges for a variety of reasons. And that continued on as I got into high school and in college, and my desire to help people has always been present. Now, my Welsh cousin, Dick Griffiths, would say that my fight for justice and peace is part of my Welsh background. And so we'll have to ask Apostle Richard James if that's the case. And then when I worked at Norton Heights, when I was working with the Bible Club and the Homework Club and working with kids on peacemaking, I was working with children of color, primarily students or children that were from Hispanic backgrounds and facing immigration issues and all of the different ways that they were encountering challenges in our society, but also Black children. And I just became more sensitized to that. And now, as I live here in Des Moines and I'm close to my family, I have 3 children in my family, my great niece, 2 great nieces and a great nephew. who are all children of color. And I think about what has happened in our country just over this, for example, over the summer with George Floyd, and looking at Amari, who's going to be 3 this month, and wondering if, as a young Black male, he's going to have to worry about being shot while running down the street playing, or getting a candy bar out of a store, or misunderstood. And it breaks my heart for the children of today and the children of tomorrow. And so I feel a compelling reason to continue in my life this desire and interest in peace and justice, especially when it involves people on the margins.
Those are amazing stories. I love hearing these threads of themes. Vince, your involvement with the civil rights movement and the poignant choice that you made between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., with that sensitivity already developed at a young age for the way of peace and choosing a nonviolent path, and your story of learning and then becoming one who teaches others. Both of you, it seems, began that journey as young people. Kris, as a child, hearing stories of Zion, the peaceable kingdom, that sense of justice for all, that deep inner yearning to help people. And then your work as a pastor of a congregation that was in the midst of an ethnically and racially diverse neighborhood, bringing you side by side with people of different backgrounds and color. And now your own family representing a similar diversity just deepens. Both of you have such a sense of compassion and desire, which, wow, what a combination of being fully present in people's lives, but a commitment to doing something and taking action. In 2020, COVID-19 plunged our world into a global pandemic. And today, February 9th, 2021, we are in the early days of the vaccine rollout. Infection rates are sky high, and the future is uncertain. But the pandemic is only part of the 2020 story. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black American, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, while being arrested for allegedly using a counterfeit bill. During the arrest, a white police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for about 9.5 minutes. Mr. Floyd was handcuffed and lying face down. 2 other police officers assisted in restraining Floyd, while another officer prevented bystanders from interfering with the arrest and intervening as the horrors unfolded. Early on during the arrest, Mr. Floyd complained about being unable to breathe. Once on the ground and restrained with an officer's knee in his neck, he became more distressed and complained repeatedly about breathing difficulties. He verbalized fear that he was about to die and called for his mother. After several minutes, he stopped speaking. He stopped moving. Minutes continued to pass. Finally, an officer checked for a pulse and found none. Bystanders continued pleading, but the kneeling officer kept his knee firmly against Mr. Floyd's neck, only removing it when the medics told him to do so. George Floyd was dead. The encounter lasted 8 minutes and 46 seconds and ignited a chain reaction across the nation, inciting large protests against police brutality and systemic racism in more than 150 American cities during the weeks and months that followed. But it didn't stop there. George Floyd's murder triggered waves of activism across the globe by the tens of thousands at a time. Estimates say as many as 26 million people participated in the USA alone. So, Vince and Kris, the question I would like to ask you now is, how did this event impact your life and ministry and the direction of the diversity team in Lamoni Heartland Mission Center? Vince, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. First of all, I would emphasize this event was extremely impactful, and not only to myself and as any and all African Americans or people of color throughout the world, if you will, because I had the occasion, as all of us did, to see protests going on in London and various places throughout the world in Australia. So it was very impactful. Narrowing it down here to Lamoni Heartland Mission Center, it impacted our mission center because our people would believe that social media, and I'm not a big fan of social media, but in this case, it was very beneficial because everyone had a camera. And a young lady, very clearly with great guts, went ahead and filmed the whole thing. And it's because of her taking the nerve and filming that and posting it on social media that people who typically were blind to those types of things occurring in the United States, especially in the northern part of the United States, and heard about it for years if they were at all aware, but thought it was just made up or not real or not severe, were really made aware. Their eyes were opened, and people who typically were passive about this type of things began to say that, what can I do? I need to do something. This is horrific. What can we do? And a year prior to that incident, when I was Mission Center president, I had a work session to work on it and putting together a diversity workshop here in the Lamoni Heartland Mission Center. And I asked for volunteers and got several volunteers. And then I asked congregations to contact us regarding doing a workshop in their congregations. Well, the response from the congregations was zero, and no one responded. And so the people were very interested. The group of 12 were still very interested in being part of a training and presenting, but we were going to respond according to request. Well, there was zero. There was nothing. And during that time, Glenn Johnson came to be our Mission Center president. And during the George Floyd time, Glenn was also impacted by what was going on with George Floyd. And he had stated and started that and asked Kris and I to restart and be involved and head up our Lamoni Heartland Mission Center Diversity Workshop. And because of COVID, we did not have the opportunity or occasion to wait for congregations to respond and ask us to come in, but we were able to take a new and different approach to our presentation modality, which proved to be significantly more effective than the one that was proposed the year prior to.
That is fascinating, and to hear just the beginnings of your story, and also how COVID impacted the response and the method by which you shared. Kris, what is your experience of this event and how it impacted you, your life, your ministry, and the direction of the team?
Well, like as Vince said, and like so many of us, I was horrified by what I witnessed on TV and social media regarding George Floyd and all of the other cases that had preceded, or not all of them, because we have no way of knowing the extent of the violence and of the disease of racism and how it's impacted our brothers and sisters for the past 400 years. But it was either the next day, either the 26th or the 27th. I woke up and I was scrolling through social media and I saw something about, it was a an invite to listen to some podcasts that had listening in the title. And I thought, oh, this might have to do with spiritual direction. So I clicked on it, and it was about listening. And it was a podcast that was talking about listening to what's happening in the country and to the feelings surrounding racial injustice. And the podcast, the talker, the presenter was interviewing an author who had published a book called Good White Racist. And there's a question mark at the end of that title, and her name is Carrie Connolly. And I just felt something stirring in me, like I need to do something. I can't just sit and watch what's happening without responding in some way. So I listened to the podcast, and then I wrote I made a comment in the social media feed saying, I would love to get a book group going and study this book. And the person that was helping with the podcast responded and was giving me some encouragement. And so I responded again. And then ultimately I had a little text back and forth with Carrie Connolly saying, hey, if you do a group, let me know. I'll jump in on Zoom sometime. So I thought, oh my gosh, I've got this opportunity, what am I going to do now? So I called a good friend of mine who's here and said, what do you think? I've never done this. She had never started a book club, but we felt motivated. And so I put it out on Facebook. Hey, if you're interested in learning about systemic racism and what our role as good people, that idea of I'm a good person and I'm still racist. How can those two things go together? And so I put it out there with a beginning date, and I had about 40 people sign up. But what was interesting, let's say that was maybe the day after the George Floyd, so maybe the 26th. I was looking back at my calendar on the 29th. I'd signed up for a class on Julian of Norwich because I was going to be doing a session with the spiritual formation team about Julian as a mystic. And during the presentation, there was a time of questions, and I asked the presenter, what would Julian say to us about the disruption and the upheaval in our culture today? And he mentioned, this presenter referenced a podcast he had done earlier in the week with an author named Carrie Connolly. Here I was taking a class 3 days after I had heard this man interview Carrie, which started me on this journey of gathering with others who are interested in learning what we need to do to change. I just thought, what a God moment that was for me. And of course, I could hardly keep myself contained. I had to tell him, and I don't know what he thought of me, but Sue and I had our weekly class, and we had people from around the country, all church members, and we ended up with probably 25 regulars that showed up every week until we got through the book. And then when we got through the book, they said, we don't want to stop. Can we still meet? And so perhaps 10 to 15 of us meet every month just to give support to each other. How's it going with your anti-racist work? Carrie Connolly did jump on to one of the calls, was a gracious author and shared as a white person, navigating as a white Christian female, navigating the waters of what it means to become anti-racist. Not just an ally, not just someone that likes people of color, but someone who is actively working and speaking her voice to address issues that have to be said. And because she has the privilege of being white, she can say things that others can't. And then Vince invited me, or Glenn invited me to be part of this team. And so all these things were flowing together. I feel very much it was led by the Spirit and touched those places in my life that have always been linked to fighting for peace and justice.
Talk about divine synchronicity in both your stories. I mean, Vince, to have the vision and the prophetic presence in the Mission Center to establish a diversity team and lay a little bit of foundation so it was there. And both of you finding each other in a, I mean, I know you know each other, but having your paths cross in this new way, and just the threads of this divine synchronicity bouncing around. Now what we want to know is, tell us all about the diversity team and this workshop series that your team launched in Lamoni Heartland Mission Center. We want to know about your vision, the focus of the content you've prepared, how you delivered it. We know you did it online, but we're all learning about what that looks like. Maybe some of your goals and hopes for this series. And how does this all connect with mission?
I think I'll go ahead and start, if you will. I first want to commend our team in that thus far we have had approximately 6 classes, and in February we will have a privilege class taught by our Mission Center president, Glenn. But our team have stepped up and said that, yes, I would like to be a part of it. Oftentimes saying, yes, I'd like to be a part of a committee or of a board. It's a matter of occupying a chair. But this is a very hard working team, the diversity team, each of them. And what we have done is that we have looked at many different aspects of racial injustice and systemic injustice and racism and prejudice and biases and privileged, the many aspects and identified topics. And different members of our team have chosen to take one of those topics and to go in deep study regarding that topic. And not only deep studying, but in preparations for a 90-minute presentation. And so I commend the team for doing that. That's not easy work. That is hard work. And Kris would say also, our team members are very passionate, as we are, regarding the topic. Hence, I believe, and maybe biased, but I would believe, hence the quality of our presentations in the Lamoni Heartland Mission Center from our team members. So again, we have people who have volunteered to be a part of the team, and some we've sought out, and we will continue to do that in 2021, seek out members to be a part of the team. We will be discussing again our continuations for 2021 and topics and how we are approaching them. And as we move out of isolation, how are we going to bring this information to the individual congregations? So those are in regards to your question to the directions we're going to go. That is not quite decided yet, but we have decided that we must continue. We have recognized that diversity competency is not a destination. It is a journey. Becoming a welcoming congregation is not a destiny. It is a journey. And it's a journey that we all should be constantly working on. And I believe very strongly that when we know better, we do better. And we constantly should seek to know better, so we're constantly doing better.
Yeah, I would say I agree wholeheartedly with what Vince has shared, and I think that's one of the surprising things, and we can talk a little more about that in a little bit. But one of the surprising things for me has been this team of people just ordinary church members and leaders in the mission center. All of us are white. We've all lived from that perspective, and yet with that desire to understand and to, because of our understanding, be able to change. So some of the topics that we've talked about in these 90-minute presentations have been, discrimination and prejudice. What are those? What's the difference? And really getting into this idea of that we encounter prejudice, that we are raised in a system that fosters fear of the other. And so for people to say, oh, I don't have a racist bone in my body, would not necessarily be accurate, because we all have prejudices and isms that we struggle with. And so many of those are deeply hidden within us. We're not even aware until they rise up and surprise us. And so implicit biases, we've talked about those, and where do those come from, and how do we deal with them? We've talked about the whole topic of inclusion and diversity. And Vince has shared his story, and I think has shared some elements of what it's been like being a church member, one of the few Black church members in the Lamoni Heartland Mission Center, and as a leader. And I think he has shared so personally and vulnerably that it has allowed, it's invited people to want to go deeper. As you mentioned, as Vince mentioned, we're going to be talking about white privilege this coming month. And that can be a very hard topic for us to discuss, because I remember some of the comments were things like, I can't be privileged, I grew up poor. And so to say, yes, you may not have had economic privilege, but by virtue of your skin being white, you have privilege that you didn't ask for, that you're not even cognizant of. And it's not about taking away your privilege, but it's about using your privilege to help others that don't. And so that we have equal access to all that we need. So we've had a variety of topics, microaggressions, and how those covert, intentional, and unintentional, most often they're unintentional, things we say and that we do impact the lives of members in our families, in our congregations, in our communities. So our goal is really to raise the level of awareness of the things that we do that are unintentional, that we might just be good people, but we do things that are not helpful because we don't understand. And as Vince said, when we know better, we do better. And so our goal is really to help empower, and we're learning at the same time. So I wouldn't say that any of us consider ourselves on the team, perhaps except for Vince. I would put Vince in that expert category, but the rest of us we're all learning, but we're teaching as we're learning and learning as we're teaching.
That's fascinating. And I love your list of topics. They're just on the mark, and this desire to go deep, to not just skim the surface, but kind of intentionally work your way through these various topics. So your goal to raise the level of awareness and empower people to be and do better. I'm hearing your hope as wanting to impact and effect change to help us be better communities. So you launched into this new chapter with the diversity team, with a team of people that are really dedicated and putting a lot of work into this. You had all these presentations, they were delivered online. So how did things unfold? I mean, what was it like? And tell us also about the journey of of the Spirit, how the Spirit moved in people's lives. I'm assuming that you witnessed that as you traveled the way together with these really tough topics that, in my experience, requires us to take a long, deep, honest look in the mirror and just look inside ourselves. So tell us about the experience of living in this and how the Spirit moved in and out of it.
One of the things that I've had the opportunity to experience during our time of presentations, and again, because of COVID, we're not out in the congregation in the field, so we are able to have that, as we call it, the Latter-day Saints chats, or whatever, and the lobby talk, and the talk over our potlucks after our services and things like that. But periodically, I have an occasion to be in Zoom meetings with different topics with other of our church members. Or for some reason or another, we across path, or a person will purposely contact me to let me know that they had an aha moment, in that for years, someone would say, I have been saying this, that, or what, and I did not recognize how offensive that could be perceived. I don't really want to offend anyone, but when you said that, and I thought of myself and what I've been stating, I was ashamed. And I just want to let you know that you woke me up, and I was made aware. And I've heard that more times than I could count from people. And interestingly enough, people often say that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, some of the people that have been telling me that are elderly people, and who have been doing it for years and years. And some people that are telling me that are people who grew up with it. Their relatives and their father, their mother, their uncles, everyone has been using certain terms and calling people various things for years and years and years, and they thought it was just common. They didn't see it offensive, but they were made aware that it is very offensive, and that we cannot create a welcoming congregation when we were tossing up roadblocks like those type of unknown biased statements that can be very turn-offish to people and close the door on the welcoming congregation that we want to create. So I have enjoyed experiencing that. And I know there's more out there. I'm looking forward to when we can actually rub shoulders with our brothers and sisters, and I can actually answer more personal questions from our brothers and sisters from what we have stated. I have been pleased that we've had a pretty consistent number of people who have tuned in to our Zoom meetings, which tells me that people are getting something from them. So I'm very pleased about that. The other thing in regards to the question that I forgot to mention earlier is that one of our goals, specifically my goals especially, is that I believe that our church and our affiliation is a very, very loving. I mean, when you talk about a community of Christ, it's in the name, and it's in our mission. It's in our enduring principles. It's in everything that we write, everything that we sing about, everything that we preach about. Zion, the welcoming of anyone and everyone, being a welcoming people. But I'm not sure that all of the saints know how that looks. I'm not sure that all of the saints know how to do that. And our goal is not to browbeat someone into submission. Our goal is simply to inform them. The doctrine as the church has written it, the doctrine as the Bible has stated, the doctrine of Jesus as he's lived it out, and as we, as brothers and sisters of Christ, as members of the community of Christ, are called to live out in our lives so that all of our brothers and sisters will feel loved and welcomed and not marginalized at all.
Beautiful. Kris.
Yeah, how have I witnessed the Spirit at work in the midst of this this journey. One of the things, the element of all of our presentations thus far has been the sharing of information, and our presenters have been creative in the way they've done that, using videos and music, and as well as sharing it through scripture and research. And then we have used the small breakout rooms with Zoom, that feature, for there to be a focus question for people to share around. And we've had our team members as members of each of those breakout rooms so that they can help guide or report back. And so what I'm beginning to see deepening among this group of people, I don't know, 30, 35 people that continue to show up for these monthly presentations, is a growing trust of sharing vulnerable and deep things, attitudes, feelings, things that, as Vince was saying, those aha moments, and being invited to think, okay, so what do we do with that? How do we translate this knowledge into our communities? And so they're feeling the leading of the Spirit to say, okay, this works for us. We're learning, but what do we do with that? And I think it's easier for people in the cities, where we have some diversity, although moving from Kansas City to Des Moines, I miss the level of diversity that I was used to. But we've got folks from rural Iowa who are saying, I don't know any people of color in the town that I'm living in, or I don't have access to people whose lives are so different than my own. And how can you help us? How can we have access? And so there's this yearning. They want to engage. We don't have an easy answer for them. But the answer, I guess, for regardless of who the other is to somehow find a way to interact and to develop a relationship. Not to march in and say, hey, I'm trying to learn everything I can about being anti-racist. Why don't you teach me? But to be in relationship and to seek to learn by doing and by being with. So I've seen the deepening of the relationship among members in the Mission Center, seen them showing up. We in Community of Christ, we want to learn, we want to be better. And I just want to share a little story of something that happened in the book group. And like I said, they were all church members in the book group. And Sue invited a Black man that she used to work with that lives out in Washington, D.C. He has his own faith affiliation, his church affiliation. But we invited him in as a guest, and he returned and was a guest with Vince on another one of our conversations. But Jay, he opened himself up. He shared his story, and he took questions, and he was blown away by the fact that a group of 30, as he said, old white people, which offended me that I was old, but that these 30 people showed up, not because they had to attend a diversity training, which is part of the work that he does. Nobody was paying them to be there. There was no work expected. This was an evening of their own time, and that they had been showing up week after week. He could not get over it. In fact, he told his friends about this group of older white people who want to learn how to be better, how to do better. And I think in Community of Christ, that's where most of us are. We don't necessarily know what the avenues are to get there, but it's just a reminder to me of not that we're better than other people, but there is something deep within our DNA. And maybe it is that dream of Zion. Maybe it is that desire, the way we live out our enduring principles. But there is a uniqueness about us that to the rest of the world could look very, very special. Like, who are these people and why are they showing up? Why are they listening to a podcast about this? when they're not getting paid, there's no incentive except they love God, they want to be a disciple of Jesus, and they want to live into a world that can be transformed.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those little windows into moments of inspiration and transformation and real life stories of people. So what was the most challenging thing, do you think, about this endeavor? Something that maybe felt pretty difficult?
I think for myself, the timing. And as I mentioned earlier, a year prior to us beginning, I made an effort to begin something in our mission center. And the most difficult thing for me is that it got off base and got going well because of a horrific event. And it was a very horrific event, but it perpetuated people into action. And as you had mentioned earlier, and as Kris had mentioned earlier, that we have thousands and thousands and thousands of people throughout the United States and the world that went into action. And when just a year prior to that, when I made an effort to begin and ask congregations to respond, no one felt a need to respond. And people told me, why do we need to go to a class and learn how when it's clearly written right here in front of us? It says it right here in the church mission, and the church's enduring principles. But yet, again, we're reading it, we're singing about it, but we're not necessarily living it. And people were having a hard time accepting the fact that we were not exactly implementing it to its fullest degree. So the most challenging thing was the reason and the way that it started, because there were some emotions associated with that. But I do appreciate the people who agreed to participate in the educational process, and I do appreciate the people who have agreed to learn and still agree to learn. And as Kris mentioned earlier, we are just anxiously waiting to see if people will take it into their congregations and actually live what they've learned and begin spreading those methodologies and those thinkings and the new learning within their congregations.
I think
How about you, Kris?
I think for me, the challenge with this kind of work, my own personal challenge, and I would say, I'm guessing it happens for most people, is just the sustainability of attention and intention. You know, Vince was saying that this liftoff of this dream of this team and this kind of work, you know, was the liftoff happened because of a horrific event that captured our attention and broke our hearts. And I think as human beings, we are much more likely to react to a crisis than we are to sustain the discipline of change when things calm down. I think that's just our human nature. We're often distracted by the next thing that happens. And yet, this kind of work that we're talking about, and we have focused primarily on the issues of racial diversity and the issues facing people of color in this country. But we have so many other areas of diversity to explore and to expand upon. But we've started with our focus in this area because it was right in our face and it needed to be addressed. So I would say the sustainability, keeping people engaged and interested and involved, especially when, as Vince was saying, we're not able to be physically engaged. We're doing it all on screen, which has its own issues. But that would be what I think would be the most challenging.
So how about the surprises? What did you encounter that surprised you or you didn't expect? Kris, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I do, because having worked at headquarters and being around people with, great expertise and excellent presentation skills, and they're just people, quality leaders. And I was saying something to Vince about this earlier, that what has been so surprising to me, pleasantly so, is that, as I mentioned, we've just got ordinary folks that don't work for the church, but are committed to the mission of Christ, committed to the church, doing their best in creating presentations and investing themselves. These are not professional speakers, and yet they are doing quality work. And I guess for me, that's really encouraging, because I think, I'll be guilty of saying, like with the book club, I wanted the author of the book to talk to us. And since she offered, I took her up on it. And sometimes we're waiting until we have access to that number one expert, or, a special person in leadership, or maybe someone whose name won't be a big draw. When in reality, we can learn just as ordinary, average people. We can learn if we have the passion and the desire and the support. And I find that really empowering and exciting and a very pleasant surprise.
And how about you, Vince?
Well, there are several things. First of all, what comes to mind in reference to what Kris was stating about the team and what we mentioned earlier, being standing up and being involved in raising their voice, and the recognizing that there are many people. And what has come to surprise me and please me a great deal is that many people are recognizing that they have a voice, and they recognize that their voice has been silent for a long time. And they recognize that, as Dr. Martin Luther King stated, that at the end, it will not surprise us of the negativity that we receive from those who despise us, but it will surprise us by the silence that we have heard from those who are to be our allies. And that silence is deafening. And I think people recognize that they have been silenced for too long. And I am pleased and surprised about the number of people who have raised their voice and gotten up off their seat and marched, have been active and are still seeking additional ways to becoming active. I mentioned in a lesson that we had about a week ago about an experience that I had just recently on the 6th when we had the insurrection at the Capitol, and an incident that I had here locally with our local Texas Roadhouse about with a person that could have been involved in the insurrection at the Capitol, that type of person. And I had been convinced to mention that during one of our lessons. And I personally was surprised about the responses that I've gotten from a significant number of people who surprised me, that typically would not have stated anything in regards to sorry about that, how that happened to you, that should not have happened, and so forth. So the level of awareness to participation and getting involved and stop being silent has surprised me. It pleased me a great deal as well. And if we can enhance that, we all will be super surprised. What I would like to do also is that nationwide, we've had a lot of very articulate, meaningful, passionate young voices that have stood up and made themselves known and had marched and have made their argument and doing all the right things. We look at the people that are doing the right things, and I'm pleased because I'm tired. And I am looking forward to the young voices taking charge and continuing to lead the march.
We can all clap for that. So I'm thinking, as people listen to us talk today and to your story that folks are thinking, how can we do something like this in my mission center, in my community, in my neighborhood? So Vince and Kris, I want to move into asking you what might be some principles or maybe some guiding questions, a couple tips that you could share to help folks begin to explore possibilities, and maybe something that you wish you'd known before you started that somebody else might learn from.
Well, I'll start. I think a track like a book where people can read and discuss is a good beginning. I know when back in May and June, lots of book clubs were getting started all over the place. And somebody had made a comment about, oh yeah, that's what all the privileged people do when there's a problem, is they start a book club. And I felt kind of like a little slap in my face, even though it wasn't directed at me, but I recognized, yeah, that is only one level of awareness. But that isn't necessarily going to change behavior. It's really, I think, about engaging in relationships with others that really changes it. Just as, like Vince has said, hearing from people in the Mission Center comments and support, because he's been willing to be vulnerable and share his story of hurt and pain, and because they love him and respect him, they respond. And that kind of reaction doesn't come from a book. That comes from a relationship. But I do think that perhaps starting with a book could be a safe way to begin having conversations. There's some structure. There's a little bit of detachment so that it's the author is saying versus, I, Kris Judd, or, Vince Lewis is saying. But regardless of what happens, whether it's a book group or a discussion group or an engagement, there has to be some guidelines for how you're going to behave with each other. How do you make that a safe place to really share what's happening in your own heart and mind as you're encountering ideas, as you're looking at yourself and doing that inner work of acknowledging those places that are not whole, of repenting, of and making amends if and where necessary, and of committing to change. And so whether that is, having some guidelines on, in this group, this is what we do to make it safe, and there's some great resources out there on how to do that. Inviting the voices of those who've experienced the oppression and the marginalization. So making sure not that they're just a guest, but that they are, we often bring our own education and experience and dismiss the voice of lived experience out of our own privilege, and we're not even aware that we do that. But inviting to be part, those voices that need to be heard, and always being respectful that we are taking steps on a journey, and committing to be as supportive as possible to each other as we do this, because it's hard work. And as Vince says, the people that have lived this, lived the results of our ignorance, and they're tired. And we can't look to them to teach us. We've got to take the mantle on what it means to learn to include, to invite, to appreciate, to accept, to embrace, to receive. It's our turn to do that hard work.
How about you, Vin?
What immediately comes to mind is our song, A Place at the Table. And we not only need to set a place at the table for those that have historically been marginalized, currently marginalized, but also listened to them when they are at the table. There have been so many corporations who believe that by inviting a marginalized person to the table, that they are doing their duty, but they don't recognize that they are undermining that person at the table. They're not listening to, they're talking over the person at the table, and they're not respecting the value of the person. So whether it's a business table, whether it's our dinner table, whether it's our Pepsi table, or whatever it may be, but inviting people. And as Kris has stated, that when we establish these relationships, then they become a part of us. And the only way that you are going to bridge the gap from the unknown to the known is by the establishment of the relationship, which means that a person may need to go out of their comfort zone, and you cannot do change by doing the same thing that you've always done. And so one may have to step out of the boundaries of their regiment to place themselves in a situation where they have an opportunity to interact, to know, to see, to be with, to learn from a different population, therefore begin to build that relationship both ways. And I would refer us again, and I kind of hesitate doing this because hopefully people are listening to the podcast that are not necessarily yet Community of Christ, but seeking to learn more about Community of Christ and to be a part, because again, people are asking how, what do I do? Where do I go? We have so many things written in our doctrine, in our information about what we should do. And we look at things like, you who are my disciples must be found continuing in the forefront of those organizations and movements which recognizes the worth of people. That's in our doctrine, and that is in Doctrine and Covenants 151:9. That's just one of many. We look at 163. We look at 165. I would encourage our people to read and our own doctrine, and not only to read it, because I think a lot of people boast about that they've read it, but have you owned it? Is it in your head or is it in your heart? If it's in your head, then yes, you can boast about you've read every word of it. If it's in the heart, then you may not even read it because you've gotten stuck on a certain phrase of that doctrine, and it's in your heart, and you chew on it, and you develop a program, you develop a how-to, you ask yourself, what does this mean to me? What is this saying to me? How do I do this? And I think that if we truly look at our doctrine, it's a roadmap. It says to us in many different ways how and what we can be doing as a disciple to make our Community of Christ congregations and body all that it is called to be. And that is a really, really great place to start because it's clearly written out there.
I love what you said, Vince, about going from our head to our heart. And for our listeners who are beginning to learn more about Community of Christ, we recommend Doctrine and Covenants, and start at the end of the book and read forward, and you will get a sense of our current day scripture and sacred text. So, Kris and Vince, what are your hopes for Community of Christ as we live into the future? Kris?
Well, my hopes for Community of Christ have very little to do with how we gather or what we do, and have more to do with who we become. And I think we're in that process of becoming a people where our enduring principles are truly reflect what we do value and who we are. Becoming a people where presentations on diversity and inclusion are redundant because we're living with the gifts and the blessings of diversity and inclusion. In fact, maybe we don't have classes on how to, but rather celebrations of. I look forward to a time when spiritual formation the going deeper within, and the prayer practices, and the deep listening to Spirit and to each other and to our own stories is just as natural as a worship service. I mean, we spend as much time spending time doing those things that it becomes so natural as a part of our individual lives that when we come together in gatherings, the joy and the depth of love that we have just overflow. And our gatherings become truly times of honoring what God is doing in our midst. And that it's a time of celebrating what God is doing, and not sometimes to me, church feels like it needs to be a cheerleading session to go out and do good things. And I look forward to the time when, because of our formation individually and communally, because we are living and breathing those enduring principles and the mission initiatives of inviting people to Christ and abolishing poverty and ending suffering, which we look at the work that we're doing on this team as being engaged in our mission. You know, when our gatherings are times of sacrament and celebration, and the cheerleading is you keep going rather than get started. So that would be my hope, and that could look a million different ways depending on where you're at, but always that fellowship together, that connection with Jesus Christ, and our awareness of the Holy Spirit in us and in our midst.
And Vince, how about you?
Very briefly, what comes to mind is a statement that I've said frequently over the years as I've done discipline workshops and as I've talked to students and talked to my staff and parents in my parenting groups is say what you mean what you say, and do what you said you're going to do. And I think that is my hope for us as a people, in that our church has said, and our doctrine has said what it means. And it means what it says. And my hope is that we as people will do what it says we will do.
Amen.
I love that. That's not the first time I've heard Vince share those words, and I was hoping he would share them today because they always make my heart sing, Vince. Yeah. So as we prepare to close, Kris and Vince, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners today? Vince?
I would say that I thank the listeners for tuning in. I hope that they have taken away something from our sharing. I hope you've been stirred and incited to go forth and make a difference. I hope, if anything else, that you will recognize that you have a voice. And there are many people, marginalized people in our community and in your community that do not have a voice. And that because of your voice and the blessings that you have in your voice, you are called upon to be the voice for those who have a marginalized, a silent, or no voice at all. We all can do that. It is in every single one of us to make a difference in our world. And no difference, no change is too small. No change is too insignificant. We do what we can, where we can. We grow where we are. And hopefully everyone will seek their place and find what they can do and do it in God's name.
And Kris, did you have any last comments you wanted to share with us?
Well, I don't know how you can add anything to what Vince has just shared. I will say two things. God delights in each faithful step taken. And we've been told that in recent words of counsel to the church. And so, do what you can. You may think it's a small thing, but each of those small things adds up to the kind of change that God is yearning with us for God's creation. And thank you for listening. And I like Vince, am hopeful that we've shared something that has encouraged you or inspired you or puzzled you or amused you, but something that's touched you in a way. And we trust that spirit that is at work in you will continue to do that. So thank you for your time and your listening ear.
Well, it's been a joy to have both of you with us today, Vince and Kris. And I just want to lift up something Vince said at the beginning of our interview and remind all of us, diversity competency is a journey, not a destination. And each faithful step, as Kris said, is celebrated by God. So thank you again, Vince and Kris, for being with us, for sharing your stories with us, and giving us such a vision of hope for what can be. And of course, a very special thanks to all of our listeners. If you would like to hear more stories about mission, check out our What's Brewing series. If you have questions for our guests, just go online to Lamoni Heartland Mission Center. Google it and the website will come up and you can read all about the diversity team and ways to get in touch with Kris and Vince. This is your host, Robin Linkhart, and you are listening to Project Zion Podcast. Go out and make the world a better place. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Project Zion Podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or whatever podcast streaming service you use, and while you are there, give us a 5-star rating. Project Zion Podcast is sponsored by Latter-day Seeker Ministries of Community of Christ. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are of those speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Latter-day Seeker Ministries or Community of Christ. The music has been graciously provided by Dave Hines.